The first sign of the Great Blight that hit around the 1st of August could get a stench, a smell off the potato stalk before it turned black. And a fog came down that was seen from Bantry Bay onto the Ox Mountains in County Sligo. And the blight was universal, and despair set in on the sight of it.
They would go to bed at night and everything was fine. They'd come out in the morning and there was this horrible smell all over the area and the plants were blackened.
They were dumbfounded. They stood in disbelief looking at the fields turning black, knowing that their livelihood was gone.
There was nothing inevitable about the Great Famine. Nothing in the potato people's way of life that could only be remedied by the deaths of 1 million and the emigration of 1.5 million more. The famine was a piece of bad luck, a natural disaster whose horrors were multiplied by the arrogance of man. The peasants, bewildered, asked themselves, what was this blight? Where did it come from? Was it static electricity from the new trains that crisscrossed the Irish countryside? Were there vapors leaking from inside the earth? Or was it the will of God, punishment because they'd sinned? They would flee Ireland and strive to reinvent on the streets of America the world they left behind. We know little about the individual lives of those who died during the famine. In County Mayo, in the far west of Ireland, 1 out of every 3 people would disappear. Most often, there are no birth or death records, no gravestones, no family portraits to remember them by. The survivors were themselves silent, reluctant to talk.
My grandfather came from Mayo. He never talked about it. He just came. For him, for me, I mean, I sort of saw him as coming out of a blank past.
Sie de gemacht oi no people no color.
The lucky who got relief earned enough to feed their families once a day. Laborers fainted on the sites. Children went hungry to keep their parents fed. As news of the harvest was circulating in Ireland, a small vessel, the Virginius, docked in the St. Lawrence River near Quebec. It left Ireland with almost 500 passengers, but at the end of its journey, less than a dozen were strong enough to walk down the gangway. More than 150 had died on board. The rest were quarantined in fever sheds, hollow-eyed skeletons. Their passage had been paid by Major Dennis Mahon, landlord of Strokestown, who had sent his tenants off as the best way out of his troubles. His long campaign to collect rents had come to little. His agent, John Ross Mahon, had written to him laying out the facts. If you want your land to be profitable, most of your tenants must be cleared off. The agent's arithmetic was simple. It cost £7 3 shillings to keep a pauper for a year in the workhouse. It cost less than half that to ship him abroad. Begin the evictions. Send them to America. what are the cheapest routes. His agent wrote back, New York, Boston, or Philadelphia, £4. New Orleans, £3.10. The cheapest was Quebec, £3, 3 shillings, half price for children. They were the poorest of his tenants. Many were sick. At Strokestown, in the end of May, they climbed aboard the horse-drawn carts that would carry them to the dockside at Sligo. They brought with them their bedding and rations and whatever else they possessed. In their rags and memories, they were on their reluctant way from past to future. Many of the famine survivors, who had hoarded their passage money and fought their way to the ports, knew that their deliverance had come at the expense of kinfolk and neighbors. To survive, they had to unlearn the communal codes they'd been reared on. Before them lay the Atlantic crossing, but they already lived in a new world. 1.5 million of them got out, more than during the previous 200 years.
Thousands upon thousands of people, many of them my relatives, left these glens and valleys to go out to the United States, fleeing from hunger and disease. When I stand here, I can see 500 years of my family's history. Out here, the McSweeneys had a castle. They were chieftains and they were driven out of there and eventually came in here. The Campbells came in with them and they spread out across this landscape. Other branches of my family, the Gallaghers, the Boyles, the O'Donnells, the Dohertys, all lived in these glens and stayed there until the 1840s when, as a result of the Great Hunger, they moved out of these glens in droves and went out to Pennsylvania, to Boston, to New Jersey, and to New York, and all across the United States.
The famine Irish, poor, Catholic, and fiercely communal, would come to define Irishness in America. But they would have no Plymouth Rock, no Ellis Island. No single place would mark their arrival. In life and in death, they were, for the most, anonymous. On the levee of New Orleans, their only hope for the future was that they would not starve.
All of the sick were laid out on pallets, one beside the other, just skin and bones, too ill and too weak to really even beg for food.
They went out grubbing for food, and grubbing means scratching, sometimes scratching in the earth, maybe looking for rotten food on the levee. The most miserable ones picking at straw from the street. And the group that struck contemporary observers as the saddest group were the lost children.
Parents had often fled Ireland without their children, and only later secured enough money to send for them. But no parent could be sure of what ship their children had boarded, and even if they knew, news of a ship's arrival didn't always reach them.
They would actually advertise for lost children or a lost child. Mary O'Connell, sent to New Orleans between such and such dates, aboard the steamer Atlantic, lost in the city.
Some are rather heartrending, trying to describe a child named Mary who doesn't know her own last name, and the parents desperately trying to find them. Not with much success, I suspect.
For the newly arriving Irish, New Orleans was a purgatory, a netherworld between the watery crossing and the solid ground of America. Most of the city sat at the bottom of a bowl-shaped depression, surrounded by the Mississippi River, Lake Pontchartrain, and hundreds of thousands of acres of marshland. The high ground was long since settled, so the Irish were forced into the bottom of the bowl, where they watched the waterways drain back at them, flood their streets, and fill their homes with swamp water. These neighborhoods were a bilious soup, thick and festering. Typhus, cholera, and consumption seeped into the population. In the sweltering summer months, mosquitoes bred in the cisterns and the swamps and carried malaria, hemorrhagic malaria, and the most feared yellow fever. The Irish were especially susceptible to these diseases because once they were strong enough to go to work, the jobs they could find were in the swamps.
Very few of them had skills except for scratching a living in a potato patch. So they're going to take whatever job is available, what anybody will pay them to do. And one job that's available for an immigrant who's willing to risk his life is what's called ditching. That meant that you, in an area like South Louisiana, like New Orleans, you have to have ditches to drain.
Slave owners, for example, respected black laborers much more than they did Irish laborers. So you put the Irish into places draining swamps where they could get malaria. You put them in kind of working situations where you wouldn't want to risk black slaves.
Slaves were an investment by the slave owner, where you'd only have to pay Irishmen wages. If a slave was killed on a dangerous job, the entire investment was lost. If the Irishman was killed, he just got another one. There was no downside to using Irishmen. Chew them up, spit them out, get another one. And there were plenty coming in the famine ships.
The Irish have a sense coming into the United States that for all the differences of this transatlantic passage, they run a very good chance of occupying the bottom place in American society. And that's one of the causes of the tensions that will exist between Irish and African Americans, this kind of people at the bottom, a kind of classic American confrontation of who's going to get up the ladder, that there's not room for both of us.
Free people of color were already moving up that ladder, working in skilled trades like masonry, carpentry, and tailoring. For the unskilled and the slaves, what little hope they had came from hard labor.
When the Irish came, the jobs were held by the black people of the city, some free and some slave. Even the slaves were allowed to work from time to time for pay. Some of the masters split the pay with the slaves. Others let the slaves have the pay and save it toward buying their own freedom.
The one skill the famine Irish knew was survival. Wage-paying jobs promised survival, and the Irish meant to do whatever it took to get them. This was the beginning of one of the longest-running racial grudge wars in the country. And by 1850, it was already being played out in the ports of Charleston and Savannah, upriver in St. Louis and Cincinnati, and in the big cities of New York and Philadelphia. In New Orleans, the Irish fought their way out of the swamps.
The most readily available jobs were on the docks. The Irish had to have those jobs. There was no other way for them to survive. So they fought a very desperate fight. If they didn't get the job, where did they go? There was nowhere to go. If they didn't get the job, they would starve and their families would starve. So the Irish would come up against the blacks, form gangs, and just attack them.
Irish gangs would stone black laborers or beat them up. But when the blacks fought back, nobody else stood with them. The Irish were white men, after all, and free to do what they had to. By 1853, the Irish in New Orleans had taken over the jobs on the docks as stevedores, riverboat crew, bailmen, and on the land as draymen and hacks. And there was a sense that New Orleans was a place the famine Irish could make it. That New Orleans, after all, might just be a lucky town.
In 1853, there was a sense of optimism in New Orleans. The newspapers and some of the medical journals even were saying that yellow fever was a thing of the past. That New Orleans had gone through 4 or 5 years without any real epidemics.
On the 27th of May, I believe it was, the first case of yellow fever was reported in the city.
City officials refused to establish a board of health for fear it would scare trade away from its bustling docks. The immigrant ships, unwarned, continued to carry their payload to port.
There was a term used at the time, always in the newspapers and the reports, called unacclimated, which meant newcomers. Because yellow fever, of course, once you've lived through it the first time, you develop a certain immunity to it. Well, the Irish were all unacclimated. All the famine Irish had come over after the last epidemic. As it got into the summer months, the incidence of yellow fever picked up. We were going from 9 a day, I think the first week of July, and then it was 15 to 20 a day the next week, and went up exponentially from that point, to the point that it was, by the middle of August, there were 220-some dying a day.
The Catholic priest who had the responsibility of last rites and of burying the dead and having some service, they never stopped. The funerals were constant, so that the business of the city was burying the dead.
During the months July and August of 1853, almost 1 Irishman in 5 died in New Orleans. In Ireland, during the years of the famine, the 4 or 5 years, 1 out of 7 died.
It was October before the weather broke and the epidemic subsided. By then, 10,000 people were dead in a city of little more than 100,000. Native New Orleanians were horrified, sure that it was the immigrant and not the disease that had turned their city into a necropolis. The Irish should stop coming to the tropical climate of New Orleans, the harshest critics advised, and go to Boston, to a climate more like their own.
My great-great-grandmother came to Boston in December of 1851. And if anybody knows Boston winters, it was very cold. And these passengers were noted to be half naked. You know, that they had very little clothing to begin with, and it certainly wasn't heavy winter clothing.
The Irish peasants from the very beginning looked physically ridiculous. You had men in hats that hadn't been worn in 30 years in any fashionable areas, and long-tail coats and leggings. People aren't dressed like this anymore. They're comical. They don't know they're comical till they get off the boats and people are laughing at them.
Before leaving for America, few had been more than 15 miles from home. They identified themselves by the landscapes they knew, their county, their townsland, their parish. And they entered Boston mistrustful, insular, not a little bit frightened, grasping for safety in the familiar and faceless enclaves growing within the city.
They went to where their friends and families were. And in Boston, the North End was one of the premier Irish neighborhoods. But even within the North End, the Cork people went to the area around North Square, whereas the Donegal people would go over around Endicott Street, another part of the North End.
My grandmother used to talk about Cork Hill. That's where all the Corkonians stayed. Then there'd be Galway City. They wanted to be with their own kind, so they considered Galway here and Cork here. It was a distinct entity.
Native Bostonians watched this clannish new immigrant population and grew increasingly uneasy. In 1 year alone, 30,000 Irish Catholic immigrants entered the city of little more than 100,000.
The Irish lived in shanties. They lived in buildings that had been inhabited by the residents that were here before they got here. In the homes that already existed, people would have to vacate because they certainly didn't want to live with all these Irish. So when they came in, they would split the room up. So something that originally housed maybe 6 people would now house 36 people.
Reports circulated of destitute immigrants living in dank basements and lightless garrets. Epidemics swept through Irish neighborhoods and threatened adjacent ones. The can-do Bostonians took up a study of the problem of poverty. They thought they could fix it, but the Irish just kept coming.
If you think of what the Irish were doing at the time, it meant that poor people not only were poor when they got here, they were voluntarily staying poor in order to get the next batch over. So that Americans who may have been sympathetic to their poverty start to really begin to blame the Irish as being a very stubborn people that is never going to wholly embrace American values.
They're filling the jails, they're filling the orphanages, they're filling hospitals. Anglo-Protestants are saying these people are ruining our city. They're destroying this beautiful city on a hill.
Humanitarian crisis all tied to immigration. Migrants coming here to the city is unfolding on city streets, and we are more than 2,000 miles, of course, from the southern border. New York's leaders say they are struggling to house more than 57,000 asylum seekers currently in the city's care, more arriving every week. Some of those migrants without beds indoors have been sleeping on the streets. Mayor Eric Adams is now sounding the alarm and says he wants the federal government to take action. And Mayor Adams joins us right now. Mr. Mayor, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Yesterday you said you're on pace to spend $5 billion on migrant care in this fiscal year. To give people some perspective, that is more than the city spends on sanitation, parks, and the fire department combined. So you're asking for money here. Do I have that right?
A combination, more than money, because the faucet is flowing. We have to stop the faucet. We have to make sure we have a real decompression strategy at the border. And we have to ensure that we have real immigration reform, because it's going to continue. It's not sustainable. When you look at 10,000 a month, the math just does not add up.
The governor of Massachusetts made a calculation reminiscent of an Irish landlord. It would be cheaper to send the destitute back to Ireland than to support them in America. The most shrill condemnations, however, issued from the Yankee working class, a class of people frightened by changing times. Displaced farm workers were being forced into low-paying jobs in the factories of South Boston and outlying towns. Skilled craftsmen were being shoved aside by machines. Competition from Irish laborers only stirred the pot.
The average pay of an Irishman per day in Ireland was 8 cents. So can you imagine? Over here, an average workman was paid $1.25 a day. And here's a guy who's willing to work for somewhere between 8 cents and $1.25.
Popular depictions of the Irish, the wild Irish as they were called, would grow more and more cruel. In the press, they were portrayed as drunken, dim-witted, addicted to a fight, simian, and as Catholics, a threat to democracy itself. And the numbers were alarming. While Protestantism was splintering into new evangelical sects, Catholics were on their way to becoming the largest denomination in America. In the 1850s, the number of naturalized citizens in Massachusetts, most of them from Ireland, tripled.
Somebody described the Irish family structure as a hill fort. The whole community was inside the fort. They were impregnable against the world. And then when they came out, you'd be out in the world, and then you'd have to take your chances.
Irish kids fought turf wars with Italians from the North End and Jews on Blue Hill Avenue.
I dared you.
Their parents in these Depression years tuned in to the radio priest, Father Coughlin, who stirred the pot of anti-Semitism.
Would drive the money changers from the temple.
Sundays, they bought his paper, Social Justice, on the steps of Catholic churches. In an angry world, the church was a rock of comfort.
The church was your security. You know what I mean? And whenever there's a problem in the family that your parents couldn't handle, they'd go to the priest and say, well, Father, what should we do about this?
For the ambitious ones, the mythic story of the Irish as underdogs was a challenge that aroused extravagant longings to beat the Yankees at their own game. No Boston Irishman took up this challenge as relentlessly or with such consequence as Joseph P. Kennedy. In 1909, when he went to Harvard, it was enemy territory for the Boston Irish. But Joe Kennedy was immensely popular, a leader of his class. In his innocence, he hoped to be tapped for one of Harvard's elite clubs, extensions of New England's Brahmin society. After he was blackballed by the Porcellian Club, he never forgot it. He shaped a career as an Irish Horatio Alger, an aggressive outsider making his way in the world.
You'd have to imagine Tom Foley's salon, crowded, Sunday afternoon, there were no women. There's my grandfather, as small as he was, and his father, as large as he was, sitting down at a table with Tom Foley, some of the other party regulars, and they'd sit around and talk about local 4th District politics.
Here was another measure of Al's father. He could sit down with Foley. Big Tom, as they called him, and not just for his blacksmith bulk. Foley was a proprietor, a solid man, and the district's Tammany boss. A wheel in the biggest engine of power that the Irish of New York knew.
In the 1880s and 90s, we are in the golden years of Tammany Hall. Gold in more ways than one, I might add. The machine was organized very much like the Catholic Church, with the boss as the Pope, and then the district leaders were the bishops, and then the precinct leaders were the parish priests who were tending to the faithful.
Tammany was a creature of its times. A machine, they called it, awesome and modern. But it still conducted business face to face and within the neighborhood. Jobs, contracts, money you gave out to family and friends. That was the first rule. Take care of your own. The Bahoys were simply functionaries in the vast Democratic Party, but in the neighborhood they were stars, with their swell coats and derby hats. If your power stretched just a block and a half, still a Tammany man was someone to be.
The precinct captains were the one who had the closest connection with the people, and he was from the neighborhood. They knew him, they knew where he came from in Ireland, or where his parents came from in Ireland. They knew his background. They had grown up with him. He was one of us.
He knew everybody by name, by first name. He knew their foibles. He knew everything about them. And if Patty McSweeney was thrown in jail for being drunk, well, he knew that Patty had a tendency, a weakness, as they called it, you know, or as another way they described it, just one fault. He was a fine man, but he just had one fault. He might slip the cop $5 and get Patty out of jail. Patty would come home and swear he would never take another drop. He was circulating through the ward all the time. If there was a wedding, he always showed up at that. And he never missed a funeral.
They'd be sitting and consoling the widow or the children, and all of a sudden when the doorbell rang and the door opened up and there he was, there was the local representative, it was like, stop everything, everything went to a hush. Here he comes, he's here. And he'd go in and pay his respects to the corpse, and then he'd leave. Wouldn't stay too long, just the fact that he was there was enough for the family. And that's sort of, there was an element of pride that he came to my father's wake. That meant something.
So come with me and I will treat you decent. I'll sit you down and I will fill your can. And along the street, all the friends I meet say there goes Muldoon, he's a solid man. I control the tunes, I control the island. My constituents, they all go there.
And they'd ask every single person in this district, remember Mary Moran, what we did for you when you ran out of coal last winter? And Mary Moran would tell John, her husband, John, get out there and vote. Vote the straight ticket.
These ward healers weren't about social policy or the fate of nations. In this village, Washington was 1,000,000 miles away, a place you'd hear about from newspapers, if at all. By age 12, Al Smith was a newsboy, shouting out the headlines to his neighbors. Grover Cleveland takes over the White House. Geronimo surrenders. And the great John L. Sullivan shakes hands with the Prince of Wales. Now,
here was a man who was loyal to Tammany Hall, who was totally regular. Yet, here was a man that the Citizens Union, who had once given him the lowest rating, was now giving a very high rating. Here was a man who was getting favorable editorials in the New York Herald. And Silent Charlie Murphy understood that perhaps this young man would be the instrument that would change the image of the Irish in America.
And, John, by legislative enactment, today is the first day that lager beer in excess of 0.5% may be legally possessed, transported, or sold. I'm sure it's a happy day for us all. It will deplete to a great extent some of the ranks of unemployment. It will help to promote happiness generally and to produce good cheer. That's something that we all hope for and we all desire. We have great confidence in the future of our country. The United States will stand out. She will come back. And while the process may be slow, we will have the happiness and the satisfaction of knowing that there is from today on a little better feeling.
see you. Well, it's supposed to be nice to have you. Good to see you, man. Thank you for feeding us.